A third core value of our church is this concept of humility. Now, this might be the hardest one yet. We've already talked through prayer, and that it's a conversation both individually and corporately with the Lord and His people. But and then yesterday, fellowship out of Acts 2, and this connection to the apostles' teaching, and how really as we build a church around relationships, we're called to help and equip each other. And that's where we get straight into this concept of humility. Now, humility is kind of a word that's just thrown around in our culture, where it's in some ways entirely opposite of arrogance, and I get that, right? Arrogance is boosting yourself up and making it all about you, and humility is certainly not. But humility is also not just looking down on yourself and looking inwardly and saying, I'm nothing, I'm worthless, who am I? Humility, I've heard it best put it this way: humility is not thinking less of yourself, but of yourself less. Now, here's what I mean by that. Let's start with the less of yourself. Again, it's not looking at yourself saying, I'm worthless. I've got nothing to offer you. Now, some of you may be feeling that way, or at least in certain seasons of your life, and I get it. Depression's real, and I'm not going to sit here and try to make light of it or to be superficial about it. But I want to encourage you that part of your story here and now is that God's not done with you yet. And this is where fellowship is such an important piece of humility, because we get to look at each other and to see each other and to celebrate what God is doing in each other. One of the phrases you'll hear a lot around our church is this concept of I see in you, where we look at one another and we are able to know each other well enough. We can point out and celebrate each other's gifts and strengths. And so if you're feeling insignificant, if you're feeling down on yourself, I want to encourage you, the first thing you need to do is to spend time in prayer and really get around a group of people that can celebrate the good of what God is doing in you. So that's the less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less piece of that definition of humility. This comes primarily out of the idea of 1 Corinthians 12, where we see the same Spirit, yet different gifts. The Spirit is giving us as an equal share of gifts, but they're all different because we have different purposes. And again, this is where fellowship is such an important part of our church, because that's where we get to discover the gifts in each other. Sometimes when you're being encouraged by someone, you never even realize the gifts that you have within them until they point them out. So again, that's why we're going to be quick to say things like, I see in you. Being able to celebrate and to point out the value and the good in each other, how God knitted us each well in our mother's womb for a purpose and a calling. It all comes from the same source, that's the Holy Spirit, but we each have a different calling in our life. And that's what we get to build around in our church, is this concept of walking with people, sharing with them our strengths and our weaknesses, celebrating and discovering them in others, and then building a church that commissions those gifts and commissions those callings and those purposes. But those callings and purposes aren't to boost yourself up, right? We already talked about that. That's arrogance. So we have to bring in another passage, the idea of Philippians 2, where we see Jesus being our ultimate example. Now, he is the King of Kings. He is the mighty one, the Lion of Judah. And yet, what does Philippians 2 tell us? He sets his throne aside and he humbles himself to the point where he takes the form of a servant. His story is that he left a heavenly throne, which we get some amazing descriptions of how just lavish this throne is, how glorious this throne is. And he entered the world through a stable in a very small, seemingly insignificant town in the Roman Empire. And yet, through this Jesus, the world has been radically changed and has been ever since. But it's because he emptied himself, taking the form of the servant. You see, he knew what his deity and his godness was like, yet he used it to serve the world rather than to take from the world. And that is humility. Humility is looking and recognizing what the Spirit has gifted you and is doing in and through you, and using it to advance his kingdom, using it to serve your neighbors. If you're good with carpentry skills, it's helping to build homes for the homeless. If you're a good cook, it's serving meals as you host fellowship gatherings. If you're just a great listener. It's just being a good friend and being there when people need you to be there. You see, we all have different gifts, but they all come from the same Spirit. And that's one of the things that is so exciting about this church and our movement is, again, knowing we have that same source of origin of our gifts, yet we all have different callings, and building a church that seeks to facilitate and grow and celebrate and commission those callings. So today I want you to spend a couple of moments and just ponder. What strengths do you really have? And do you use them to help others? Because that is true humility.